Hello fellow Reaperites and welcome to the weekly tutorial. Today I'm going to be showing you how to cut, trim and extend your items in a productive fashion. Right, so let's start off with how you cut items in Reaper. So by default when you install the software you get a shortcut key for splitting items, and that shortcut key is the S on the keyboard. So if I select an item, such as this audio item at the top, I can press S to split it, S again to split it into different parts, and then I can move those split parts around. There is a slightly more productive way of doing this though, and I'll show you that now. If I just basically go back to how I was, start from scratch again, go into the Actions window, which is Shift question mark, and if I search for the S shortcut key, so at the moment the action it's using is split items at edit or play cursor, but you notice up here there's a split item under mouse cursor, and I think that's more productive because you don't have to select the item first. So if I take that and let's assign the S key to this action instead. Okay, so close that. Now if I go over an item I can just hit the S key and I don't have to select the item first, and it goes straight into cutting it, and then I can move my items around. And just to show you, if you do want to recombine the items at a later stage, if you move them back together there is an option of healing those items. There isn't a default shortcut key for it by default, but I'll show you how you assign it. So I've just healed all of the items there. If I go into the actions, here's the action, heal splitting items, and I've allocated the H key to it, but out of the box there is no shortcut key for that, so you may want to assign that yourself. Okay, now let's look at how you trim items in Reaper. So again, starting with the default settings, you'll notice that on the left edge and the right edge of each item the mouse cursor changes, and you can use that when you see that mouse cursor you can use that to drag the items in or out, but you're not actually removing anything, you're just changing what actually plays and the window of that item, so you can then stretch it back out again as well. And you can see the little notch at the top shows you the start and the end of the item. It will start looping after the notch point in a MIDI and an audio item. So that's the way you would do it if you didn't have any actions associated with it, but it's not very productive if you want to quickly go in and, for example, just cut it at a bar line and then cut the end of it as well. For example, I might want this to start on bar 17 and go on for a bar or 2 bars, and I really want to be able to do something like this, where I hit a key to trim it on the left and hit a key to trim it on the right. So let me show you how you set up those custom actions. So we'll go back into our actions, Shift question mark, and you'll see I've set up a couple of custom actions, trim left and trim right. Let's have a look at the trim left one first to see how that works. So this is my universal action, pretty much the first action of everything I do. Select the item under the mouse cursor. So that's the item I want to work on. And then I'm going to move the edit cursor to where my mouse is. And then I have an action which trims the left edge. So that effectively gets rid of everything in that item to the left. And as you can imagine, the trim right is pretty much identical, except for the last action, it trims everything to the right of where my mouse is. So between those two actions, it's a really useful way of actually quickly trimming the left and right of an item while you're working on your project. So there's only one thing you have to be aware with trims, which is that they're only trimming what you play and what you see. But if I try and loop this, it's still going to show me what was hidden away. So it's not actually stopping the audio there and looping it. Similarly, if I do it with here's a MIDI track here. Let's take this MIDI track and trim right. So you can see it's got notes going down and then some 4 notes quickly ascending up at the end. If I trim right and then I try and drag out those 2 notes, it's not effectively repeating those 2 notes. It's repeating the whole of the 4-bar loop. Now, sure, I could trim with my shortcut and then I could copy items, but if I wanted to copy this 100 times, that's just not a productive way of working. So what I really want to do is trim items such as the audio, such as the MIDI, and have them so they're ready to loop. And the terminology that Reaper uses for where you trim something and then set it in stone is called gluing an item or glue an item. So in order to get that to work, I need to add the glue item to my custom action. So let's go back into the actions. And you see I've added another couple of custom actions, trim left and glue, trim right and glue. If I look at those, it's the same action with just one extra item on the end, which is to glue the items. And that then sets them as the new set in stone item. Let me give you an example. So let me reassign my 2 shortcut keys. I've used the square brackets. That seems to remind me of sort of cutting left and cutting right. So let me add in these new actions, taking over from the old ones. Okay, so now the left bracket is going to do trim left and glue, right one is going to do trim right and glue. So let's reset this back to the original loop. Okay, so we now have our 8-bar loop here. This time, if I trim left and right, we actually now have a new glued item. You see, now this loops just those items there. Similarly, if I do this on the MIDI item, trim right, now we're actually looping the correct items. Now, something to be aware of here is that because Reaper is non-destructive, you have got this new item here. You haven't lost the original file. If you go to your media browser, which is Control-Alt-X by default, you can see that the original file is still there. So if you did want to go back to it, you could drag it in and you could go back to the original version if you accidentally cut too much, for example. Okay, finally, I want to talk about how you extend items, and I'm going to show you 3 ways of doing this. Again, by default, let's see what happens. If you take an item and you extend it, if it's a MIDI item, it will by default loop. You can switch that off and it will just get empty space. But if you do want to loop items, then you're not really extending the item, you're just looping what's already there. There is one key you can use that by default. If you use the Alt key, it has a hand item and you can stretch it out. I mean, that's useful in some cases, but most of the time that's not what you want to do. You want to just extend empty space. So as I said, let's look at 3 ways we can do this. So the first way, and this is something that really commonly happens to me, sometimes you've set up a recording for 4 bars or 8 bars. You start recording your MIDI part and you get excited when you've got it right and you hit stop and you haven't quite got to the end of your 4-bar or 8-bar loop. So you want to extend this out to that last measure, or I think it's an 8th note that I've missed it by. You can see at the moment, if I try and loop this item, it's slightly out and it's effectively not going to be doing 4 bars. It's going to be doing sort of 3 bars and 3 notes. So I've set up a custom action for this where it will extend a MIDI item to the time selection. And if I hit the shortcut key for that, it extends it out, and now the looping is perfect. 4 bars, 4 bars, 4 bars, all the way. So let me show you how that item works. Go into the actions, and I've got this extend MIDI item option here. If I edit it to show you how it works, there's a couple of things in here which might not be obvious, but I'll explain them. Again, my favorite action, selecting the item under the mouse cursor, and then I'm having to use an SWS action to save the item. This is because when it extends it, it loses the selection and I need to restore it later in order to re-loop it. So you'll have to install the SWS extensions, check out the description below, and you'll see a link to the SWS extensions. So I save the item, then there's this very useful feature to insert or extend MIDI items to fill the time selection. Now I restore my item, and the reason I do that is because when it does this insert or extend, it loses the loop option within that item, so we need to restore it with loop item source. So if you make a note of that, put that in, that's a really useful shortcut you can press just to extend to the time selection. Okay, I want to show you the second way now, and this is something that exists pretty much by default. You just have to make sure that one preference is set. I'm going to show you how it works first of all, and then I'll show you what preference you need to set up to make sure it works. So let me just undo what I just did. So I've got this item here that's not quite 4 bars. If I double click to edit, and I'm in the MIDI editor, what I can do is I can basically double click where I wanted to extend it to. So you see it's not quite made it to bar 5. If I double click on bar 5, it extends it out. So now we have the proper loop point for this, and that's a nice quick way when you're in the editor of dealing with that. Now to make sure this works, you need to go into the preferences, that's Control P by default, go to the MIDI editor and check this option. Double click outside the bounds of any MIDI item to extend the nearest MIDI item. And if you have that checked, then this function will work. So you can elongate the loops of your MIDI items in the MIDI editor. Really, really useful. And while I'm in here, let me just show you something. You've got a couple of interesting options when you're in the MIDI editor. When you're right at the end, you've got this, it may be difficult to see, but you've got this arrow with 2 dotted lines. And if you extend that, you're extending the MIDI item, but you're not changing the loop point. So you're actually looping within the MIDI editor. If you go in slightly, there's an arrow icon with just a single dotted line, and that is the loop point. So you can change the loop point within the editor. So actually you can do expansion and contraction of the loop within the MIDI editor. It's a little bit fussy because you've obviously got to find that particular point. And I think the double click one's really useful for extending, but just thought I'd show you that you can do all of that within the editor as well. And I want to show you one final method as well for looping. Again, this is one that I set up and I use sometimes. It's using the mouse modifier for double clicking on the edge. So this current loop here, you remember we trimmed it earlier, it's looping those 2 items. So I want to make that 4 bars. So if I go into the preferences, mouse modifiers, and I look at media item edge, double click. I've set this is not something you'll see, you'll probably have nothing in there. If you set it to this action, so you basically double click on it and choose the action list, set it to item properties loop item source. And what that action does is toggle whether that item loops or not. So what that means you can do is you can double click, extend the item, so now it's not looping, and then double click again, and now you've set the loop again. So it's again another way, if you're not in the MIDI editor, it's another fairly quick way of extending items and getting them to loop again. So I hope you found today's tutorial useful. If you did and you liked it, please subscribe in the link below, and I'll see you next week.